CBS News senior national security analyst Juan Zarate is in Washington, and he joins us now. Juan, why does the president feel that that would be a mistake? What kind of intelligence is he getting that would lead him to believe that, given the ground that ISIS has made in Syria and in Iraq, putting boots on the ground would be a mistake, and just airstrikes alone will be enough to dislodge them, in addition to using the local forces on the ground?
Vlad, I don't think this is driven by the president seeing anything differently than we are or getting any more information. I think this is driven by his policy framework and a strategy where the president has not wanted to get mired into the Syrian conflict, has not wanted to send troops back en masse into the heart of the Middle East. And in part, that's why you've seen him continuously argue in this all or nothing sort of modality, whether it's, sending hundreds of thousands of troops in or doing what we're doing, which obviously is not working and obviously hasn't constrained ISIS's reach, its time, its space, its resources. And so, the president really has not, from a policy perspective, wanted to get more involved, and certainly has not wanted to send more boots on the ground, to use their terminology, into this fight.
Juan, how can the president's strategy continue to work as he hopes that it does when you continue to see more of these different cells and terror groups popping up? And then, obviously, with this attack, it changes the game for a lot of people, not just in Paris, but people here in the United States. Any chance that in a week or two to come, we'll hear about a different plan, a reconsideration of what was said today at that summit?
I think there are probably two or three things that could change the calculus for the president at this point. One is information that demonstrates that the Islamic State is planning attacks against the West, and that is happening in material ways against the United States and the homeland. That then changes the equation for any American president and may require him to be more aggressive about what he does with U.S. military force and intelligence services and resources. So that's one thing. Second is what France decides to do. France obviously is not going to act wholly on its own. We'll want to act with the U.S. and other partners. But the French are at war. The president has now said it multiple times in Paris, and again today. If the French decide they want to put boots on the ground, that may draw the U.S. in further. We saw that play out in the context of Libya, where the U.S. was reticent, the French were aggressive, the British were aggressive, and we were drawn in some ways. Finally, I think there has to be a policy debate, and no doubt it's underway within policy circles, even if it's not within the core of the White House, about whether or not time is on our hands, on our side, and whether or not time plays to our best efforts. And I think the president has laid out a strategy that will take time. He has talked about a long war. But the question is, do we have time while ISIS continues to adapt its capabilities and its reach? And I think somewhere in the policy world there, in the White House, and certainly in the interagency, they are having to have that conversation. Do we have time to allow this longer-term strategy to work, or do we have to be more aggressive in our disruptive actions and change our strategy?
Juan, President Francois Hollande has said he will meet with President Obama and Russian President Vladimir Putin. And President, in his remarks today at the G20 in Turkey, said that right now it appears, especially in the wake of this horrific attack on Friday, that the president and these other world leaders agree on a process that needs to happen to end the war in Syria. Are we going to see perhaps a little bit of a different interaction between Vladimir Putin and President Obama, given now that France is stepping into this war very, very aggressively? Could we see these three world leaders and Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, united, whereas before we might have seen President Obama and Russian President Vladimir Putin sort of at loggerheads?
Well, it's a good question, Vlad, because what you've seen in Vienna is a political and diplomatic process to try to resolve the situation in Syria. You now have a timetable to try to accelerate a political transition. And you've now had the Russians at the table, the Iranians, the Saudis, the French, the British, all trying to come to some sort of political and diplomatic solution, which everyone agrees is necessary. It is an interesting question whether or not the French attention to this issue and the fact that France now seems to be most interested in taking the fight to ISIS on the ground, whether or not that begins to drive a different kind of coalition, one where they can bring the Russians along to begin to focus more intensely on ISIS as opposed to the moderate rebels in Syria, and certainly try to bring the U.S. along in ways that may be uncomfortable for the U.S. but necessary to enable what France does. And so The French may be the wild card here because they certainly want to be aggressive. They are at war, and they want to demonstrate that to their public. That will require them to bring the U.S. and the Russians along.
Juan Zarate in Washington, as always, Juan, thank you for your analysis. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.